Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take the sources you send us and really unpack the most important insights.
That's right. And today, we're diving into a whole stack of material you shared, all focusing on universal basic income, or UBI.
Yeah, specifically looking at it in the context of all the changes coming with automation and artificial
It's
intelligence.
a hot topic.
Definitely. You've given us a great mix here, articles, research papers, even some perspectives from online discussions.
Covering, well, pretty much everything. Definitions, history, the potential impacts, good and bad challenges, and findings from some of the pilot programs.
So our mission for this deep dive
Yeah.
is to help you sort of navigate this complex landscape.
Yeah, to understand the key arguments, what people are really debating, and look at what the evidence from these real-world experiments is actually telling us right now.
Because it is sparking a lot of debate, and you can see why, given how fast things seem to be changing in the economy and, the workforce.
Absolutely. So let's get into it. Let's
Ah.
unpack this.
Okay, first things first. What exactly is universal basic income based on the sources you sent?
Well, fundamentally, the sources define it as a government program that provides a regular sum of money. It's unconditional, and it goes to pretty much every individual or household.
Right, those key words seem really important. Universal and unconditional.
Exactly. The sources stress this. Universal means it's for nearly everyone, maybe limited by citizenship or age, but crucially, not by your income or whether you have a job.
And unconditional.
No strings attached. You don't have to be looking for work or going to school or meeting any requirements. It's just cash, not like food vouchers or housing assistance specifically.
Got it. And the idea is usually for an amount that's, well, enough to live on or close to it.
Generally, yeah. Most proposals aim for something substantial enough to lift people near or maybe even above the poverty line.
Which makes it really different from, say, existing programs like SSI or disability benefits, where you have to prove need based on income and assets.
Totally different. And also distinct from guaranteed income, which might be targeted only at certain groups and maybe not enough to cover basic needs. UBI aims broader.
What really struck me in the materials was that this isn't some brand new sci-fi idea.
Oh, not at all. It's fascinating, right? The sources trace it back centuries.
Yeah, like Thomas More's Utopia in the 1500s.
That sounds right.
And Enlightenment thinkers. Paine, Montesquieu.
Exactly. And then more recently, you see advocates across the spectrum. Milton Friedman, the economist, Martin Luther King Jr., the civil rights leader.
Even Nixon apparently considered something like it for a bit.
Briefly, yes.
Oh.
That history is important. It shows it's had appeal for different reasons over time.
And back to that universal part, why is that so key? One source seemed to really dig into this.
Right. That source laid out several arguments for universality. It suggests it bypasses errors in figuring out who's eligible, which plagues targeted programs.
Right.
It helps eliminate the stigma, the shame some people feel receiving benefits. It reduces the administrative costs, all that bureaucracy checking eligibility. And importantly, it's argued to be more labor compatible.
More labor compatible. What does that mean exactly?
Good question. So, with many current welfare programs, if you start earning money, your benefits get reduced, sometimes sharply.
Right, the so-called poverty trap.
Precisely. It can create a disincentive to work more because you lose benefits. Economists sometimes call it a high price effect on labor. With a true UBI, that basic payment doesn't get clawed back as your earnings rise.
Ah, so any money you earn from working is just added on top of the UBI.
Exactly. Theoretically, that removes the penalty for working or earning more.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's an old idea with some compelling arguments. Why the huge surge in interest now? That brings us to the AI and automation angle, doesn't it?
Absolutely. That's a major, major driver, according to your sources. There's this widespread fear, or at least concern, that AI and automation could displace a really significant number of workers.
And the sources point to evidence for this acceleration, like the sharp jump in venture capital pouring into AI startups since around 2014.
Yeah, and the big increase in industrial robot shipments between 2010 and 2016 that was mentioned.
The worry isn't just about factory jobs anymore, is it? It's about tech that could do tasks across many different sectors.
Right. Potentially impacting administrative work, creative professions, skilled labor, things people thought were safe. The technology aims to replace workers or even be, quote, better humans at certain tasks.
And the concern is that even if overall employment doesn't totally collapse, these technologies might boost wages for the highly skilled while replacing less skilled work.
Leading to potentially greater inequality, a more polarized labor market. That's the fear.
But The sources also bring in some historical perspective, which complicates things a bit.
It does. Looking back, especially in the U.S., despite huge technological shifts over the last century, the unemployment rate has tended to cycle around, what, 4 or 5%?
Yeah, it hasn't just constantly climbed as technology advanced, productivity went up, but mass permanent unemployment didn't happen.
That history suggests economies can and do adapt. New jobs get created, tasks shift.
However, one source did note the decline in the labor force participation rate for prime-age men in the U.S. since the 50s. That seems significant.
It is significant, but that same source points out this decline isn't uniform across all advanced economies. Some countries haven't seen the same trend.
So it suggests other factors are involved, not just automation driving that specific trend.
Exactly. It's likely a mix of things: globalization, policy choices, social changes, and technology.
Which leads to a really critical question raised in the material. Are we facing one big, overarching macroeconomic shock from technology?
Or is it more like a series of distinct sector-specific shocks hitting different parts of the economy in different ways?
And why does that distinction matter so much?
Because the answer really shapes what kind of policy response makes sense. If it's one huge shock, maybe a broad solution like UBI is the way to go.
But if it's more fragmented, hitting specific industries or skills.
Then maybe more targeted approaches, retraining, education, localized support would be more effective and efficient. And the sources indicate there's no real consensus yet on which it is.
Okay, so the why now is largely driven by tech fears. But the reality might be more nuanced. Let's shift to the arguments for UBI. What are the main potential benefits highlighted in your sources?
Well, the most direct one is addressing economic insecurity and poverty, especially if jobs are displaced by AI. UBI acts as a safety net, a buffer.
And simplification is another big one, right? Replacing the complex web of existing welfare programs.
Potentially, yeah. Though how much simplification actually happens depends heavily on the design and funding.
There's also this idea that it could boost innovation and entrepreneurship.
Right. The argument is that if people have their basic needs covered, they're freed up from that constant survival pressure. And they take more risks, start a business, go back to school, invest in skills.
Or engage in valuable unpaid work like caregiving.
Exactly. And we see hints of this in some of the pilot results mentioned in your sources.
Like Finland and Kenya. The sources said those pilots showed improvements in well-being, less stress, more life satisfaction.
Correct. And the Austin pilot analysis you shared is interesting too.
Yeah, it found employment stayed stable overall, but people had big improvements in food security and housing stability compared to the control group.
And some participants did reduce hours, but reportedly used that time for things like upskilling or caretaking, which arguably have long-term value.
Then there's the Give Directly study, the big one in Kenya. The finding there seemed quite powerful.
It really was. The headline finding was that the concern about people just stopping work and becoming idle, quote, never materialized.
Instead, they invested, started businesses, became more entrepreneurial.
And actually ended up earning more on average. It points towards empowerment rather than laziness.
Which directly counters one of the most common criticisms. That's huge.
It is. Other research mentioned talked about how guaranteed income can give people a sense of self or the headspace to dream, enabling them to plan for a better future, not just react to crises.
There was also a more theoretical point in one source about worker power.
Yes. The idea that if UBI is set high enough, and maybe paired with regulation, it could give workers in low-wage or precarious jobs an exit strategy.
Meaning they could afford to say no to bad jobs or exploitative conditions.
Precisely. It could strengthen their bargaining power by providing a basic alternative. It could help decouple income from production, allowing society to share the benefits of automation without tying everyone's livelihood to a traditional job.
Okay, those are some pretty compelling potential upsides. But obviously there's another side to this. What are the major challenges, the criticisms that critics raise, according to your sources?
Well, the first one, the elephant in the room, is almost always the cost. Fiscal sustainability.
Right. Giving a meaningful amount of money to everyone is, well, it's incredibly expensive.
Hugely expensive. Financing, it would require substantial government spending. And that usually means significant tax increases.
And the sources mention those microsimulations. Computer models showing the impact.
Yes, they simulated UBI in several low- and middle-income countries and found that achieving real poverty reduction often meant taxing the wealthiest 10% at rates that might be politically impossible.
Or, if you fund it differently, say through sales taxes.
Then it could hit middle class and lower income consumers really hard, potentially negating some of the benefit.
What about other funding ideas, like cutting existing programs or using resource revenues?
The sources suggest those often aren't sufficient on their own, or things like resource revenues can be too volatile, too unstable to reliably fund a universal program year after year.
Okay, so cost is massive. What's next? The work effort question seems to be a really big point of contention.
It is, and frankly, the evidence presented in your sources is conflicting.
Yeah, we saw the Give Directly results suggesting no negative impact, even positive effects.
Right. But then another source mentions studies of unconditional cash transfers showing, quote, a modest decrease in work effort overall.
And that YouTube source you included talked about a specific study where people apparently ended up with less money, more debt, and worked less.
Exactly. So you have studies pointing in different directions.
Why such different results? Do the sources give any clues?
They touch on it. It really seems to come down to the specifics of the program. Was it really UBI or a targeted transfer? How big was the payment relative to local wages and living costs? What was the duration? What kind of economy was it in?
So a small, short-term pilot in a place with lots of jobs might have a totally different effect than a large, permanent UBI in a depressed area.
Absolutely. The context and the design of the intervention seem critical. It's often not an apples-to-apples comparison between these different studies. We need to be careful about generalizing.
That makes sense. What other criticisms came up?
Another concern is about potentially incentivizing informality. If benefits aren't tied to formal employment, people might leave formal jobs for the informal sector, knowing they have the UBI floor. This is seen sometimes with other cash transfer programs.
And what about comparing UBI to the programs we already have? Could it actually be less effective for the very poorest?
That's a serious criticism raised. Those microsimulations suggested that if you make UBI budget neutral, meaning you fund it by cutting existing programs and rearranging taxes without increasing the total budget, it might actually do less to reduce deep poverty than current highly targeted systems.
How could that happen?
Because the very poorest might currently receive multiple targeted benefits that add up to more than a flat UBI payment, especially if that UBI is set at a modest level to make it affordable across the whole population. A flat payment might spread the resources thinner, shifting some away from those most in need.
Okay, so a potential trade-off there. What about just the logistics of it?
Implementation is a huge practical challenge. Sending regular payments to everyone needs incredibly robust systems, reliable population registries, secure payment infrastructure.
Easy to take for granted in some places, but a massive hurdle elsewhere.
Especially in lower and middle-income countries, though digital ID systems are making it more feasible than it used to be. Still, it requires significant administrative capacity and investment up front.
And the politics must be a minefield.
Definitely. The political economy is incredibly complex. You've got so many different stakeholders, taxpayers, businesses, people on existing benefits, administrators, all with potentially competing interests.
People worried about losing their current benefits or facing higher taxes.
Exactly. And one source mentioned the risk of path dependency. If you roll out UBI slowly, maybe starting with certain groups, those initial beneficiaries might politically block further expansion or changes later on, locking in a suboptimal system.
Well, pilot support doesn't automatically mean national support.
Not necessarily. There are also concerns about potential inflation, though the sources suggest it depends heavily on context market competitiveness, program size, duration. Efficient markets might adapt.
And finally, the philosophical debates themselves are a challenge.
Right. UBI forces really fundamental questions about the social contract, about dependency versus freedom, individual responsibility, the role of the state. These are inherently polarizing questions with no easy answers.
So putting it all together, the evidence we have from pilots and related studies is, well, it's growing, but it's definitely a mixed picture.
Yeah, you see these positive signals on well-being, reduced stress, maybe allowing people to invest or skill up, like in Austin or Kenya. Some promising signs of empowerment.
But you also see these conflicting findings on the big question of work effort.
Right. And significant concerns about the sheer cost, the practicalities of implementation, and real questions about whether a universal payment is actually the most effective way to target poverty compared to progressive, means-tested systems, depending on the design.
And it's crucial to remember, as you said, a lot of this evidence isn't from true full-scale UBI. It's from variations, targeted cash, pilots, negative income tax experiments from decades ago.
Exactly. So drawing firm conclusions about what a national, permanent, truly universal, and unconditional basic income would do,
Right.
it's still difficult. We need more direct empirical evidence on that specific model.
The sources make it clear this whole debate is so intense, partly because it taps into these really deep questions about society, about work, about what we owe each other.
It really does, and it's quite unique how it attracts support from such different camps, isn't it?
Yeah, libertarians seeing less government bureaucracy, progressives seeing poverty reduction, tech leaders worrying about disruption, some unions seeing worker power.
But that diverse coalition also means there's no single agreed-upon goal or design. Everyone brings their own hopes and fears to the table.
And it's vital to remember, as one source stressed, UBI isn't a magic bullet. It wouldn't fix everything.
Right. Many underlying causes of inequality, poor schools, lack of healthcare access, discrimination, low wages in essential sectors, those require their own solutions.
Which suggests that UBI, if it were ever to happen, probably couldn't stand alone. It would need to be part of a much bigger picture of reform.
That seems to be a fair reading of the situation presented in the sources.
So wrapping this up, looking across all the material you sent, UBI is clearly this idea with surprisingly deep roots, but it feels incredibly relevant now because of AI and automation anxieties.
It definitely holds out this promise: increased security, less poverty, maybe more individual empowerment. And some of the pilot studies offer intriguing glimpses of positive effects on well-being and financial stability, sometimes challenging those old assumptions about work incentive.
But the hurdles are massive. The cost is astronomical, implementation is complex, and there are still big unanswered questions with conflicting evidence sometimes about the impact on work and whether it's truly better than the targeted systems we already have.
The evidence is still coming in, it's evolving, and context, how you design the specific program, seems to matter hugely. More research, more careful thought is definitely needed.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting, thinking beyond the immediate pros and cons. If technology is fundamentally changing work, maybe forcing us to question if traditional employment can still be the main source of income and security for everyone. And UBI is the idea that keeps coming up, debated across the political spectrum. It really makes you wonder, are we, as a society, anywhere near ready politically, economically, socially for that kind of fundamental shift, for potentially decoupling income from work on a massive scale?
And if UBI, with all its challenges, isn't the answer, or isn't the whole answer, what other big ideas, what other solutions might emerge to deal with the future of work and income in an age of advanced AI?
Definitely something for you to mull over as you continue your own deep dive into this.